Hello, I'm Robbie Raphael. Welcome to the Deep Accessibility Podcast. I want to talk today about complexity versus simplicity when creating accessible technology. Most of the accessible technology that I have needed, or perhaps a better word for it is assistive technology, was made accessible to me in the nerve injury that I was dealing with and continue to deal with to a lesser extent. Complexity was actually a helpful thing for me to interact with my computer. Using speech-to-text programs often require you to get creative with how you interact with the computer. And if you are not worrying about cognitive challenges and you're only thinking about how many ways to interact with a computer, you start to think about how complexity can be your friend. And an example of that is you can use keyboard modifiers and keyboard shortcuts and just say them rather than mouse over to a certain region and click on it. So as computers progress, we get better and better graphic user interfaces. And with these graphic user interfaces, which are any programs with a window that you can interact with in a reasonable and thought out way by the developer wants you to use their technology in a certain way, and you can use it that way. Now, what I found is with using my speech-to-text programs was that it was helpful for me to use keyboard shortcuts that I would not have known if I was just using a graphic user interface. Because if you're having a nerve challenge and you can't, like carpal tunnel, or in my case, cubital tunnel, using the mouse can be a big problem for you. So if I'm able to interact with my computer in a way that is well thought out, and like I want to do one thing and I know the one keyboard shortcut to do that, it actually does speed you up in the process as well, which is nice. So you go from struggling to use your computer and to where if hopefully you can get some benefit and get away from that repetitive stress injury, you can go toward having a faster way of using your computer because you know these shortcuts and you no longer have to click through the graphic user interfaces. Now, as I think about accessibility challenges for population I'm developing for, the question is, how do you make sure to make simplicity of user interfaces a central part of their functionality? And that's been a kind of an exciting challenge because it's, this idea of one application for one problem. So if you want to write, and I have a speech-to-text program that you talk to, and then it talks back to you about what it has, and it gives you also a written out version of what it heard, and then that's all automatically copied to your clipboard so you can just paste it in. I'm trying to make this a bit more accessible by having a button that will just automatically paste for you rather than holding down the cord of Control and V or Command and V if you're using Apple. That I think is a big step forward. Now, I like to reflect on this because for me, making more complexity was quite helpful. And I want to talk about that in this episode because I think it's an interesting handle to get into these issues. So one of the things I used to think about a lot, and I was having most of my nerve issues when I was studying math for a math credential that I received. I thought about these ideas of combinations and permutations. So when you use a combination lock to open up your locker at school, you start with a number like 13, and then you spin the dial right or left a few times, and then you end up at 7, and then you spin it right or left the other way, and end up at 4, and then you open it up. And we call these combination locks, but actually they're a permutation lock because a combination is a grab bag of 3 numbers. In that case, I'm forgetting what number, as I said, 13, 4, and 7, something like that. Let's just say 13, 4, and 7. If it was a combination, you could mix those as 4, 7, and 13, or 7, 4, and 13, etc. But a permutation is a certain order of those numbers. So 4, 13, 7 is your permutation. You cannot deviate from that. Now, if you think of a keyboard and you think of chording keys on that keyboard, you could think of it as a permutation or a combination problem and create some interesting wider key spaces where you have, a 3x3 matrix of keys, and then suddenly the amount of different combinations you can create off of that can expand pretty dramatically. One thing that I found was pretty inspiring was the work by folks who used stenography, because that's a form of shorthand writing. And Mirba Knight, who is a big proponent of stenography, it talks about how it can be more ergonomic. And she's also a wonderful resource for learning about disabilities, because she herself works with the deaf and hard of hearing community and just done a lot of great work, and someone that's definitely inspirational for me in this process of what I'm doing now. With her, with stenography, it's just a really cool way to enter into this idea of like, how can we create accessibility through complexity? And what I was thinking about as well, and some systems that I've made some solutions for myself, is combining keyboard keys with voice. And when you create voice, when you use voice and a keyboard key together, the amount of possibilities of combinations and permutations, or whatever you want to call it, is essentially infinite. And I've thought a lot about how voice can be used to do a lot of cool stuff with your computer. Now, something that's interesting with voice is that there is a degree of voice strain that can happen when you use a program like Talon Voice. So Talon Voice is a wonderful speech-to-text program that allows you to control your computer with your voice, and at a granular level. So it's not a matter of you talking to the computer and then it writes out whatever you say. And it's also not like contrived commands that you can do to your computer. Rather, instead, it is actually quite substantial commands. You have granular control over the machine. So if you want to say literal keyboard keys, you can do that. So you can say like control, the keys have their own special words, but you can essentially say control C and have a copy happen, or a control V and essentially have pasting happen. Now the keys have little nicknames, but I don't need to get into that. But that does go back to the complexity idea, where you have to learn all these things and there is a learning curve. And essentially this assistive tech is something that you arrive at after desperation and a need to get something to allow you to do your job even. And you start, what I noticed is when I was dealing with my repetitive strain injury at its worst, so the cubital tunnel nerve injury at its worst, is that I would do a lot of kind of funky stacking of technology. So I would have a laptop in front of me, and I would also have my desktop computer, and my laptop would have voice to text, through Talon, and then my desktop would not. Or sometimes I would try to have both with speech to text on it. And you create this thing where it's funny because your brain starts getting kind of overloaded with all the complexity and how you're using things in a way that are not really built to be used the way that you're using them. And I felt at that time when I was developing solutions for myself that everything was very proof of concept oriented, and I would try things out, and then however I felt through them, I would either continue with that or stop doing it. And with the voice strain that I mentioned, that was probably one of the worst parts of it, because when you are barking orders at a machine, you get into a situation in which the computer in which you are using your voice in a way that is not really proper for your voice to be used. And the way I thought of this is that it's the idea of getting information from your brain and putting that information into a machine. So we do this through writing and we do this through typing on a keyboard, but it really isn't how we are designed to think and to operate. So the way human beings communicate is we kind of throw out seeds. And to say what I mean here, like think of art. So you paint some art, and through painting that art, you end up with something beautiful. And the beauty of that thing is derived from other people's subjective experiences. So they look at your art, they say whether or not they appreciate that art, and their appreciation is it's all up to them. But what's going on is information is being taken from the world. It's being processed in your mind, put down through a type of medium. So in this case, you could say, an easel and a canvas. And through that, people are deriving meaning from it. And you could, to make it a little bit more contrived, we could say information, right? So you're taking in information, you're processing information, and then you're putting that information onto some sort of medium, and then somebody else is decoding that information and sort of taking a different meaning from it. So there's not necessarily going to be a perfect meaning transfer, but that's kind of the way our brains are designed to process information and to communicate with one another. Now, the challenge is when you communicate with a computer is that the computer is very deterministic. And if you think of information transfer as being, entropic, so there's an entropy or a lossiness to your communication with with anybody, but a computer especially. You have all this information in your mind or ability to generate information, and then you provide that information to the computer in the most rapid way you possibly can, and that computer will either will essentially lose some resolution of that information as it goes along because information is lost. Now, when you're typing on a keyboard, if you do not have any repetitive strain injury or nerve injury like I did, perhaps that's okay, right? If you don't have a back pain or some other issue that prevents you from using the machine, using the computer, perhaps that's an okay situation. But in my case, when I was using a computer, there was sort of this idea of a budget. So I had a typing budget or I had a speaking budget. And what I noticed is that I, as a teacher, speak all day. And with speaking all day, it's okay. Like I don't really have an issue with my voice. I sometimes will, but for the most part, it works out. But when I spoke to my computer with these very short and concatenated commands, there is a tendency for my voice to hurt. And I was trying to transfer information in a way that wasn't necessarily natural. Now, what has gotten me excited is that recently there's been a lot of advancements to make computers more like us. And clearly, artificial intelligence is where I'm going with this. But I'll kind of explain my specifics of why it makes me excited and why I think it's quite useful. Now, I've had a surgery on my funny bone. So I had on the cubital tunnel, which is a channel that your ulnar nerve will go through. The elbow, I had a surgery on both of my elbows and had both of my funny bones removed. And now I have a less nerve issues. So, but I would still consider myself to have some extent, to some degree, if not a typing budget and awareness of the need to conserve myself and not just go crazy with typing or bad ergonomics or whatever. And over time, what I've realized and through gaining maturity over time is that there's a sort of a budget of everything. There's no such thing as infinite energy, no such thing as infinite, mind capacity or time itself. And I think, figured out ways to do the things I like to do in a budgeted way, and make my life about more of a holistic variety of things, including relationships, etc., and work and rest and whatnot, in a way that allows me to not have as many issues with the nerve pain, and obviously getting medical treatment being the most important of those. But nevertheless, there's sort of a full awareness, and having gotten that medical treatment, I can sort of have a holistic view on the other side of things, thinking about it. So I still like using keyboard shortcuts. I still like using my voice. I still like using my mouse less than probably most people do. I have a trackball, and I have a sort of interesting techniques and workflow that were derived from years of suffering. And I think that there have been some fruits from that. Now, speaking of artificial intelligence, one of the things that I like most about it is this idea of information transfer. So I don't see my relationship with my computer as being fully a typing and recording relationship. I see myself as someone interacting with a information device, and this information device thinks very differently than how I think, and it can complement what I'm trying to do. And as it grows in certain strengths, it informs me on what strengths I should be growing in. So if a computer can hypothetically program anything you want at the snap of your fingers, then understanding what code looks like is probably more important than understanding how to write that code itself. So you're still going to need to understand how the computer is communicating to you about the project that you want to create, rather than think about from first principles how to design that project. And I use, with artificial intelligence, a lot of what I do is ask questions and learn things. And it's definitely it's allowed me to be more open to ideas and to say that I don't know things. And it's like when you enter into any realm like I have with going from strictly being a high school teacher to now being assistive technology developer, when you enter into a field that you have to have a learning curve, it's hard to say you don't know about certain things because you don't know anything. But when you start gaining a foundation of knowledge about programming language, or about how code works, or how the computer works itself, you can then start saying, I don't know about certain technologies, or I don't know about certain ways that things interact with each other. And the payoff and return in value that you receive as you continue to learn these skills has compound returns. And it's quite a fun process. Now, what I've been noticing with so I used to code with my voice, and I'll give you kind of an example. So if I wanted to say in Python, there's this thing called a for loop, and when you make a for loop, you start out with the word for, and then you have some variable or iterable. So it's used, the letter I is often used for iterable. You say for I in, so you have an iterable in some sort of array. So in this case, you could say a range from going from 0 to 4. So in that case, you would say range parentheses 4. And then at the end of that, you would have a colon. And then below that, you could have some iteration. So in this case, if I wanted to create a for loop in Python, the language Python, that will print out the word hello world, be 5 times. I don't remember now if my pseudocode here may not work perfectly, but that's okay. I'll do my best with it. If I wanted to, with my voice, make a for loop, so in iteration of printing out the word hello world to the terminal, or printing out from the code, the word hello world 4 times, I could say the words into my speech to text program, Talon Voice. I could say, I could tell it to state a for loop. So I would say state for sit, which means state for, F-O-R, and then have the iterable I, which in the Talon Voice lexicon is sit. So if you want to say I, you say sit. So state for sit, and I would say over because I'm done with that saying the word for, right? So say state for sit, or I'm done saying the word, the character I. So state for sit, I would say over, and then I would go space, say range. So that means write out the word range, because the word say means I'm going to say a word next. And then I would say over, which means I'm not saying anything more, so don't write any words again. And then I would say args, which means argument or parentheses. I would say the number 4. Then I would have to go to the end of the line. I would say end. Then I would say colon. And then I would say enter to go to the next line. And then after that, I would go say print over. And then I would say args to create parentheses again. And then I would go dub quote to make the quotation. And then I would say sentence hello world. And that means capitalize the first word in the sentence I'm about to say. So if I was to do this quickly, I would say state for sit over space, say range over args for end colon slap or enter, say print over args dub quote sentence hello world. And what's interesting is that even as I say this right now, my voice gets a little bit sore. And what I can say instead is I can bring up an AI and just speak to the AI and tell it, hey, like I want to create a for loop that iterates 4 times, repeats 4 times, and prints out the word hello world. And the AI will write that out. And for me, I'd rather say that to an AI than actually write down with my clicky-clacky keyboard and get that down on paper. I mean, and the thing is, a lot of what we do, Microsoft released their GitHub product, not GitHub, excuse me, Copilot product for Office. And they kept talking about this idea of removing drudgery from our work. And I felt a little bit like this stuff is a bigger deal than just drudgery. But it is true that removing drudgery is good. And I think writing out that for loop is somewhat of a drudgerous thing because it's not hard if you understand programming. It's trivial, but it is a annoying task that you don't really want to be doing, right? And doing it by voice and it being this kind of just gigantic effort to try to write down something that is pretty simple is very frustrating. And that frustration is so unnecessary. And when we get away from that frustration, it's like, okay, like, it's great. You know, I'm glad to be in this new world where I don't have to worry about that so much. So that is kind of where I've come from for assistive tech development. And a lot of my heroes are people that are working through pretty complex assistive technology. And to be honest with you, I kind of enjoyed the brain buzz that you get when it feels like you're juggling because you're trying to figure out what's the next word. How do I put all this stuff together? And it's sort of like solving a puzzle in your head while you're trying to write code. And in fall of 2020, I took a programming class at Miracosta College, as they used to call it, a correspondence class, but we call it remote learning now. But as a remote learning class, and I remember in that class, like I did pretty well, but I had to do a lot of voice programming. And something that actually made me feel a lot better in that process was that like I, um, I collaborated with some of the other students, and I remember at one point this guy wanted to go to office do a meeting with me over Zoom, and he ends up screenshotting my screen when I put my code up. And this is for college credit, right? So like pretty absurd that he did that. And he's like, "Oh, can you scroll down?" I'm like, bro, what you doing? And then he told me he'll give me a graphic user interface for my code, which is pretty hilarious. Because, I mean, obviously, if someone creates a graphic user interface for you for a college class and they make the same thing for you and for themselves, how easy would it be for the professor to see that you plagiarized? And I didn't want to get in trouble with this guy because if he screenshot my code and using it, then, I might get in trouble. And I fair and square copy and pasted that code from Stack Overflow. How dare he take what I copy and pasted from Stack Overflow? But anyway, and it just gets worse with GPT, of course. But we have a different paradigm now. And with thinking about, or I have a different paradigm now, is I guess what I should say. And with the stuff that I'm developing, it's been really fun to see how users, or, people, right? People deal with this, use the technology and actually what they need and how they interact with it and what value it gets. And I mentioned earlier in this conversation, Miraba Knight. I had the pleasure of interviewing her a month ago, excuse me, I should be more specific, about assistive technology and accessibility. And she mentioned this idea of the co-development model, which is, something that's been in the ether, but something that is quite helpful and definitely something that I've seen, especially with my my folks, like, that need assistive tech for intellectual and developmental disabilities, because seeing what they need in the world through their eyes is very important. And like I just said, like, I kind of enjoyed the cognitively inaccessibleness of Talon Voice. That challenge was part of what made it fun for me. And if you're not keeping that other person in the loop, and you're not, as Miraba Knight put it, having them be the expert of their disability or their needs, even though you come with an understanding of what needs to be done from a development perspective, a software development perspective, they come from a user's need, which I think is a really beautiful way of putting it. Miraba Knight, by the way, open sourced stenography for everybody. It was something called the Open Steno project, and specifically the product was called Plover. And it's very cute because with shorthand typing, and when you chord on a keyboard, so you put several keys together to create a word, because stenography is phonetic. So you want to put like a consonant. Your left hand does the beginning of words and your right hand does the end of words, and you combine consonants with vowels to kind of create a phonetic spelling of different words. And with stenography, the word steno and the word plover, which is a bird, both are synonyms, or I don't know the exact word for it with what they call it in stenography, but essentially they would both require the same stroke. And because of that, it's just a cool play on words. And I don't know if the machine, there's a thing called a steno theory. So with stenography, they have a dictionary that is used to check if a word is, like the computer will check the steno theory to know what word to print out. And it's just a list of what words go to what strokes. And this used to be something that was completely written by hand. So stenographers in a court hearing would be stroking on their keyboard, and then you would have sort of this difficult to decipher code that the stenographer then would type longhand and put into something that the court could actually understand. Nowadays, they can do it with a computer live. And I think it was in the 80s or so that these stenography machines were coming out where a computer could cipher it live. It's just that what Miraba Knight did with some engineers was actually create a version of this that was free and open source and broke that industry, which is, I think, kind of amazing, because it's not something that it doesn't make sense, right? It really doesn't make sense for it to be proprietary technology, because all it is something that has been around forever, and it's being turned into shorthand has been around forever, and they obviously did something wonderful to improve it and make it something that a human doesn't need to go through the stenography twice in order to type it out longhand. But nevertheless, like it's just funny how making it open source just opened it up to everybody and made it a lot easier to use. So stenography, the lesson with it, though, that I think is really interesting is that this technology is used for the deaf and hard of hearing community to get live captioning. So to be involved with events that are not, where they don't have like a live sign language interpreter, and they also don't have, it allows them to understand what's happening, right? And it might be, I'm not sure what the best practice, if it's good to have someone doing steno and someone also signing, but regardless, if someone, I think the answer is, if someone's hard of hearing and they don't know sign language, obviously stenography would be better. So there's a lot of lessons. I'm definitely going to talk more about deaf and hard of hearing community, because I think another fascinating thing about their community is the deaf culture, and what that can kind of teach us about disability and accessible technology more generally. There's just a lot to be said about that. A big thing to be said is that there's people who lose their hearing and become hard of hearing versus people that identify in that community, which is really an important distinction. If you're making stuff for people with hearing loss, like, you're going to make it a lot different than people that are born deaf. And that's kind of obvious, but it's also just pretty fascinating. And there's also a cognitive difference in someone who's older and lost their hearing versus someone who's younger and who is deaf, or hard of hearing. So it's pretty fascinating discussion in its own right, and definitely something I'm interested in. And I think there's just a lot of lessons to learn. But going back to the complexity argument. So one thing that's interesting is user interfaces. So it is easier for me to prototype a product and get it out there and get people that I spend every day with working with them. I teach job skills to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So working with them one-on-one and helping them out, and maybe using one of these technology to offload some of the work that I'm doing to give them some more independence is quite useful. But right now, the way I have to run one of these projects is as a Python script, which is not going to be very distributable to other people. It would be a lot better if it was on a web server, or if it was on the internet essentially, or if it was a standalone executable file that would install on a computer or something, or an app for a phone or something like that. I think it would be more distributable, and that's sort of the direction I'm hoping to go with. But for the time being, I'm really focused on the open source world and how to create more foundational kind of accessibility tools that really just kind of test the waters. So I suppose I'm still in that space of prototyping and enjoying and exploring, and not as much in the space of refinement. And the challenge with the community I'm working with here is that refinement and having something that really works well for someone with an intellectual or developmental disability and how they use it is a really interesting question and an important question, and one that I'm definitely trying to understand more. And you could just spend your whole time with that. And the thing also is that with this community is that because we're talking about disabilities that interact with the mind, or are the mind, it's going to be very distinct. And you can have a situation with autism, for example, where the disability is more in the social connectedness to others. So if there's like conventionality is something that we might take for granted as a blind spot, that all websites have a certain layout, and someone with an autistic person who is looking at a website doesn't necessarily have that conventionality of understanding like that this is sort of the expectation of websites to be this way. And I need to learn more about this stuff. I need to learn more about what are tendencies with autism or tendencies with other intellectual or developmental disabilities, and see how things can be developed for them. And I think my catch-all right now has been simplicity. And I just find it fascinating that stuff that I learn about, where people are advocating for more accessible websites and technologies, is they talk about an approach that I think is in its own right somewhat complex. And I wonder in that research, when they talk about things like, someone who's autistic needs high contrast, they might say. And to me, I think that might be true. But I also wonder if that research is motivated by them advocating for changes and needs that need to happen, rather than just thinking about how do you actually create something that will work in the wild, right? And I really think that adding on all these things that can be done is more harm than good, probably, for this community at least. And that's really what I want to say with deep accessibility is I really think that we need to have an understanding of what works, and we need to develop things in order to learn about that. And I don't find it that interesting to say how other people are doing things correctly or incorrectly so much as to just build out what I can. And I will mention, different people that I think are doing a great job, or where things could be better. But I think having an advocacy first approach for developing accessibility, I think is silly, because actually building the software is important. And I think you need to kind of understand how the software works before you can have those critiques in a way that's meaningful. And I think another thing that's interesting too is that I have a pretty good understanding of the software, and I have good amount of experience with the people using it. But I don't have much experience with how those businesses operate that create the software, or what it means for an open source project to be successful, or what it means for a proprietary project to be successful. And if it's important to have software be well maintained and polished and less customizable, or the other way around. And these are things I'm really excited to learn about. And I've in my blog compared Linux and Apple, or Mac OS or iOS. I kind of conflate them, but nevertheless, these very customizable platforms like Linux, and these very these walled garden kind of approaches like iOS. And you look at it and you realize, well, for me, Linux and these open source and customizable and cognitively complex assistive technologies were more accessible, because I was able to access my computer and use my computer the way I intended it. But when you have a intellectual disability or developmental disability, or social, whatever it is, right, where you're having that interrupt with using the computer somehow, in those situations, Apple is clearly better. And they have this approach that doesn't allow me or Joe Schmo or anybody to go along and actually customize their computer. And that frustrates me to some extent, but it's undeniable that Apple is doing more things for this community than anybody else. And they are also the least customized and the least open. And I talk about in my blog how I actually had to, every time I get Linux, which is a free and very customizable software, operating system onto my computer, which I love Linux so much, but I've literally had to strip out all accessibility features. And the accessibility features, including screen readers and speech to text and things like that. I don't know if Linux has speech to text, but the screen reader, for example, is nightmarishly. Well, I don't want to say bad things. I don't know how bad it is, but it would not work with my audio driver, and I just had to rip it out, which is pretty funny, I think, because it just goes to show that when you have control and you have money and you have a proprietary model like Apple does, you're really able to stack things in a way that will work and like be accessible. And what's interesting with Apple, for example, is that their hardware and their software are perfectly aligned. And with Linux, it could not be further from the case. Because like an audio driver not working with an accessibility feature is some sort of hardware and software malalignment. And that's because Linux has to they do their best to align with everybody's software. And then you have a lot of software, or most operating systems are somewhere in the middle, like Windows. And most computers run Windows too. So with Windows, you get a situation where it's compatible with everything, but it doesn't do a great job really anywhere. And it's kind of a mess, but you can run any software you want. So in a way, Windows could be said to be one of the more accessible platforms because you can run pretty much any software on Windows. And because it's so popular, it's what everyone develops for and supports for, unless it's something that's specific for Apple, and then it's all on board for Apple. But Nuance was just bought by Microsoft, and Nuance is the company that makes Dragon, and Dragon is a speech engine that allows you to speak to your computer and for the computer to write down what you're saying. And at this point in history, we have enough technology for speech to text engines that we really don't need Nuance anymore. But I used Nuance for years, and their Dragon Naturally Speaking product. And Dragon Naturally Speaking is if you've ever walked through your doctor's office and seen them muttering into some sort of strange Star Trek looking microphone, they were almost certainly using Dragon Naturally Speaking for doctors. There's like a medical version of it. And what's interesting is that these legacy systems like insurance will, I'm sure, pay for, or maybe just a hospital. I guess insurance wouldn't pay for it, but hospitals and these other businesses will pay for a system that's well known and useful, like Dragon. But unfortunately, you have all these new technology coming out that I don't really think that a business would know to pay for. Like I currently use the program Whisper now. Whisper is so much better than Dragon, but that's for transcription. So that's if I say something for a long time, like perhaps this podcast, I could put it through the Whisper program and it would transcribe it almost perfectly. And for people who have not used this program, which is the majority of people, I'm sure, it is surprisingly effective. It is much better than you might expect. It's much better than Dragon is for sure. The only problem with it is it's a little bit unable to, it's slow. Right. So in being slow, it's going to have, it's not going to be able to do live kind of things. And there's open source equivalents that will do live transcription and allow you to interact with your computer at a granular level, like with Talon, the speech engine I usually use is Wave to Vec, which is by Facebook. And that's another thing that's kind of amazing, is that companies like Facebook, which we would all think of as being very capitalistic, have a lot of really, really good open source technology that I've used quite a bit. I mean, it's all over the place. Like with AI, with language models like Llama, they've done a really wonderful job. Like that's the Facebook's open source version, free version of ChatGPT. And also just a lot of the tools that I've been using to develop cool assistive tech is very often run into Meta or Facebook. They've really made a lot of great stuff. And why did that company make a lot of good open source tools? It's really interesting. And why is Windows now becoming a more open source company itself too? That's another discussion. But anyway, I think I'll end it here, but really just wanted to kind of dive into those ideas of complexity and simplicity, and how simplicity it really is where I need to build the apps I build, but and the end user, that's the kind of the operating theory that I'm under these days. But I'm very much open to ideas of complexity, and I think complexity is a beautiful accessibility angle, and it would be wonderful to see if complexity could be entered in with autism, for example, in ways that might be delightful. So it's possible that autistic folks are really good at, or a large amount of them are really good at a certain complex task, in which, like a video game, for example. And if you could use that as an accessibility tool to support something that there's a deficit in, then you could really make a lot of really cool stuff. And that's something I'm very much open to and thinking about. But I don't, for the time being, I think simplicity is really the way to go, and where I've gotten a lot of traction on. But it's really cool to kind of examine my own history and see where things are at and where they've gone, and understand how complexity can create a lot of opportunities. Because if you are able to engage in complexity, you're able to widen the power of your applications. But complexity is kind of like adding in a very, very powerful ingredient into a recipe. So maybe yeast into bread. If all you have is yeast, then obviously that's not going to be a very good loaf of bread that you're making. All right. Thank you for listening.